In the year 1609, a Catholic Frenchman named François Ravaillac is awoken at night by a series of religious visions, and as a result, he comes to believe that he's on a mission from God to persuade the French King Henry IV to forcefully convert France's Protestant Huguenots into Catholics. Although these visions may have seemed divinely ordained, they won't end well for Ravaillac, and a series of events are now set in motion which will result in one of the most unimaginable tortures possible, something called the boots, a tool which crushes, tears, cripples and obliterates the delicate muscles and bones inside the foot until the victim is unable to walk ever again. But grim as these boots are, and we'll soon cover them in much more detail, his ultimate fate will be far worse. Between late 1609 and 1610, Ravaillac made 3 separate trips to Paris, each time determined to get an audience with His Majesty in order to try and share his divine vision and get Henry IV to crack down on the Protestants within France. But try as he might, Ravaillac is unable to actually meet with his king, and this failure drives him deeper into madness. He interprets Henry's unwillingness to meet with him as proof that the king is actually his enemy, and when a war breaks out between France and Catholic Spain, Ravaillac has all the evidence he needs to satisfy his mind that the French king is no friend to Catholics. Since Ravaillac is unable to get the king to listen to reason, there's only one option left. He'll have to take matters into his own hands, and it doesn't take long for Mr. Ravaillac to get his chance. On the 14th of May 1610, he lays in wait as the king's carriage passes through the Rue de la Ferronnerie in Paris, and to his amazement, the carriage is forced to halt due to an unexpected blockage in the street. He takes it as another message, that this blockage is nothing other than a sign from God, that Ravaillac is to take care of the king personally. Whilst the royal attendants attempt to clear a path through the street, Ravaillac makes a dash towards the static cabin, hops over the wheel of the carriage, and just like that, he's inside the king's chamber. But he hasn't just bought words. Instead, this time he brandishes a dagger, which he quickly plunges into the torso of the defenceless king. To quote the chronicler Père de l'Osteya, Ravaillac climbed on the wheel of the coach and with a knife trenchant on both sides, stabbed the king between the 2nd and 3rd ribs. Ravaillac was immediately arrested, and fearing that the Parisian mob may try and lynch him on the spot, he's whisked away to the conciergerie, a large courthouse where they can properly deal with him. According to the court records, when Ravaillac was questioned about his guilt, he immediately confessed, saying, "I know very well he is dead. I saw the blood on my knife and the place where I hit him. But I have no regrets at all about dying, because I've done what I came to do." This assassin was now about to face the most brutal of recriminations, as the French authorities scrambled to try and discover whether or not there were any more accomplices in the conspiracy. Although he swore that he was acting alone, his captors were not convinced, and so it was decided that he be subjected to torture in order to loosen his tongue. It was ordered that he be tortured by a form of the boots, and in the case of Ravaillac, it was a particularly nasty contraption known as the Brodequin. It's essentially just a 3-sided box designed to fit snugly around the victim's legs, at which point ropes were used to tighten the whole thing into the wooden casing so that the victim couldn't move and their lower legs were under excruciating pressure. With this, the torturer would place a wedge of wood between the knees of the victim and then drive the wedges home with a hammer, forcing the wood between the tightly bound legs, scraping away flesh and skin, before they're finally driven all the way down, resting between the ankle balls of the victim. This would obviously create a crushing sensation, as the tightly bound legs are forced to accommodate a block of wood inside the Brodequin and the extreme pressure. This was after just one wedge had been driven home, and for serious crimes, up to 8 wedges could be used on the victim, which would essentially render the legs unrecognisable and, of course, unusable. I don't need to emphasise the incredible pain that this would cause for the victim, as the wedges are driven into the ultrafine gap between the legs, so tightly bound that the torture hand must use a 2-handed hammer in order to drive them downwards. Ravaillac was able to endure the first wedge without much complaint, but as his captors placed the second wedge between his kneecaps, he began to break his composure. The mallet came down nonetheless, and a sickening crack within the legs would have echoed through the chamber as the blood pooled at his feet and the knees and ankles started to be dislocated and crushed out of place. As the mallet was risen up once more to drive the second wedge home, Ravaillac screamed to his captors, "I am a sinner, but I know no more than I have declared. By the truth I owe to God and the court, all I can say, I have already declared. I beseech the court not to drive my soul into despair." The torture, however, continued, and Ravaillac was unable to name any fellow conspirators, probably because he had been acting alone. By the 3rd or 4th wedge, the kneecap itself would be entirely dislocated, the muscle, fat and skin of the shins would have been almost completely stripped away, and the tibia and fibula would have been utterly destroyed, causing bone marrow to ooze down his feet. The ankle ball itself also would be completely crushed under the blunt trauma and agonising pressure within the Brodequin. Nonetheless, Ravaillac remained resolute, and in the end, the court decided that no further torture should be used. He never named another accomplice, and it was deemed that he would be executed on the 27th of May 1610, around 2 weeks after his arrest. The injuries he sustained during his interrogation were so extreme that when he was finally put to death, he was unable to walk even a step towards his execution site and was instead carried to the gallows. There he would be hanged, drawn and quartered, which is described by the historian Alistair Horn in the following words. Before being drawn and quartered, he was scalded with burning sulphur, molten lead and boiling oil and resin, his flesh then being torn by pincers. So Ravaillac had certainly paid for his attempt on the king's life, and although his story was over, the story of the boots would continue. Around 150 years later, another Frenchman determined to kill their king, this time a man named Robert Francois d'Amiens, was also executed in much the same way, and during his ordeal, another form of the boots was used, this time though not as part of the interrogation, but instead as part of the punishment itself, for no reason other than to inflict further suffering. In Damiens' case, instead of having his legs tied together inside a Brodequin, he had individual feet inserted into cast iron boots, at which point the same process of wedging was employed, driving down chunks of wood into the gap between the leg and the inside of the boot, utterly crushing the shin and foot within until blood and bone marrow began to ooze out of the top of the boot. We're not sure about the case of Damiens specifically, but in some cases, the boot itself would be applied while it was red hot, searing the flesh before the crushing began, and inflaming the dermis around the area, allowing for the wedges to effectively glove the skin off the foot completely. Like Ravaillac, Damiens was also tormented with sulphur, picked at with red-hot pincers, and finally hanged, drawn, and quartered. But the boots weren't unique to France, or to this time period. One particularly grim incarnation comes as early as 10th century Scotland, although the process here was a bit different. Instead of crushing the foot inside a case with wedges, the foot and lower leg would instead be wrapped tightly with wet rawhide before being placed over a gentle fire. As the rawhide dries up and gets hot, it contracts rapidly and aggressively, causing the tight-fitting garment over the foot to squeeze with incredible force. There are 26 bones in the human foot, including a clump of floating bones behind the metatarsals. This extreme pressure would cause the shape of the foot to crush, squeezing out the loose bones with a pop, like bread jumping from a toaster. Permanent disfigurement would be an expected consequence, as the bones of the foot fuse themselves back together in this unnatural position. As if this didn't sound bad enough, it's also worth considering that there's a large concentration of nerves between the metatarsals, meaning that any pressure which squeezes these bones together could easily result in nerve impingement, as the sensitive pain receptors are ground between the crushed bones. This, by the way, happens often to cyclists today and is known as hot foot, where the pressure and shape of the bicycle pedal causes the bones within the foot to squeeze together and pinch the nerves between them. Hot foot is of course an extremely painful condition to endure, and I'll let you imagine the torment when it's taken to its absolute limit, as the rawhide contracts around a foot with the force to dislocate entire sections of the skeletal structure. Of course, this wouldn't kill you by design, the point was to inflict pain, but in the long term, it could certainly be dangerous, since the crushing process could easily inflict damage onto the blood supply to the foot, and because feet spend lots of time inside shoes or getting dirty, infection was a common after effect, and the development of gangrene could often mean death, or at the very least, total amputation. Brutal as this is, though, it's a form of torture that can be seen more or less everywhere at some point. In India, a version of the boots consisted of nothing more than 2 boards strapped to either side of a victim's foot before being gradually tightened, first completely obliterating the ankle and then finally crushing inwards until the entire foot is ground to pulp. Again, in Imperial China, you have jiagun, another crushing process by which the feet are placed between boards of wood which are progressively tightened until the feet are crushed and unusable. But don't be thinking the boots are just about crushing. Human cruelty and creativity would know no bounds, and there's another kind of torture for the feet hailing from Autun in eastern France, in which boots are made from a spongy, porous leather and then drawn over the victim's feet and legs, before boiling water was poured over those boots, eventually soaking through the leather and eating into the legs and feet of the victim forced to wear them. Another variation is to physically weld a pair of metal boots onto a sturdy floor and then force a prisoner to either stand or sit in them, and then restrain them so they cannot withdraw their feet. Then, once they're locked in within their metal cases, boiling water could be poured into the boots, steaming the feet within. For particularly heinous crimes, or if the torture master had exhausted his patience, the water could be replaced instead with boiling fat, which would immediately hit the foot with a punishing sizzle, before proceeding to completely fry the flesh trapped within. In any case, victims who underwent this kind of torture would never properly recover and would be left permanently disfigured as a result of the punishment. Sometimes this was the point, in order to send a message to others who are considering stepping out of line, but oftentimes it was pointless suffering, designed to extract information that didn't exist, such as the case of Francois Ravaillac, who endured the most unimaginable crushing, only for the authorities to change their mind and have him tortured to death anyway. This frenzy of crushing and frying would eventually subsist over the 18th century, and by the 19th century most European governments more or less abolished judicial torture, although it did occasionally rear its ugly head. The most widespread use of torture to the feet that still exists today is known as bastinado, in which the victim's feet are tied together before being struck multiple times with a cane or a metal rod, which is much more painful than it sounds due to the high concentration of nerves at the base of the feet and the fact that you'd be unable to walk during your recovery. It is still practiced in some parts of the Middle East and Africa today, although thankfully its use is in decline, but it has been known to reappear, particularly during interrogations, when a confession is needed from the victim, and it's sometimes used as a tool of discipline within prisons in order to punish those who step out of line. Sadly, it would seem that for as long as there's a part of the body to hurt and something to hurt it with, us humans will never really change, especially when it can all be licensed under the pretense of justice.